You know, in the second half of the 20th century, a quiet revolution took place all across Europe. It wasn't one fought with armies, but with things like suitcases and job applications. And this revolution, well, it would permanently redraw the cultural and social map of an entire continent and really create the foundations of the Europe that we know today. So let's dive right into that story.
This number, 15 million, this is what sets our stage. By the end of the 20th century, 15 million immigrants had moved to Western Europe. And look, that's not just a statistic, right? It's a massive force of history, one that would challenge old identities, forge new ones, and create the complex, multicultural societies we see all around us today. So that's really our central question here. How did this incredible movement of people even happen? What did it mean for the countries they arrived in? And maybe most importantly, what were the consequences when that warm welcome started to, well, cool down? That's the story we're going to unpack in this explainer.
Okay, so our story really begins in the aftermath of World War II. You've got nations across the continent literally rising from the rubble, desperate to rebuild. But this massive effort, it created a very specific and very urgent problem.
And this slide just lays out the central conflict perfectly. On one hand, you had what they called the economic miracle. I mean, factories were booming, industries were expanding like crazy, and there were jobs everywhere. But on the other hand, you had this demographic paradox. And the paradox was this: Europe's economy was growing at this unbelievable rate, but its population just wasn't. You had an aging workforce, falling birth rates. There simply weren't enough local workers to power the whole engine of progress. So what was the solution? Well, European governments came up with an official system. They created what was called the Guest Worker Program, formally inviting foreign workers to come and fill that labor gap. Now, the idea, and this is key, the idea was that they would come, work for a few years, and then just go back home. But as we're about to see, history had some very different plans. With the doors officially open, millions and millions of people answered the call. But their journeys weren't random at all. They actually followed these really distinct pathways that were shaped by history. So let's take a look at the main migration routes. Now, what's so fascinating here is how these old historical ties basically directed the flow of people. The end of colonialism meant that folks from former colonies, like India or North Africa, could move to their former imperial centers, like the UK and France. But at the same time, you had this huge migration happening within Europe itself, as countries signed these formal recruitment deals. A great example is the 1961 agreement between West Germany and Turkey, which brought hundreds of thousands of workers north to power those big industrial hubs. But here's the thing, this was never just about economics. It was a massive cultural transformation. The arrival of millions of newcomers brought new languages, new foods, new faiths right into the heart of old Europe, and it changed its identity forever. So, the crucial point is this. These immigrants were not just laborers. They weren't just cogs in a machine. They were people with rich cultural identities. They built communities, they started families, and they began to weave their own traditions into the fabric of European life. And in doing so, they really started to challenge the continent's historically uniform makeup. And when we talk about change, maybe the most significant shift was religious. The arrival of workers from places like North Africa, Turkey, and South Asia led to the biggest growth of a non-Christian religion in modern European history, Islam. It became a prominent and permanent feature of the continent's religious landscape. And of course, this cultural shift sparked some intense new debates. All of a sudden, questions that had never really been asked before were front and center. How should a secular state accommodate religious minorities? This played out in big controversies over things like headscarves in schools, and in some places, it even led to barriers that prevented Muslims from running for political office. Europe was really grappling with its new identity. For a couple of decades, this whole system, while it had its frictions, it basically seemed to work. But then, in the 1970s, the music just stopped. A global oil crisis triggered a massive recession, and that warm welcome that had defined the post-war era, it started to wear dangerously thin. I mean, you can see the whole story right here on this timeline. The boom years of the 50s and 60s with that warm welcome for workers, they just gave way to the recession and stagnation of the 1970s. And that economic downturn directly fueled the rising hostility we saw in the 1980s. And this right here is the fundamental shift, the main argument for inviting guest workers. The whole idea that they were an economic necessity was suddenly gone. With factories closing and unemployment skyrocketing, the very foundation of the guest worker system just crumbled. And what happened next? Well, it's a classic and tragic story. Instead of blaming these complex global economic forces, it was just easier for some people to blame the newcomers. Immigrants and their families were increasingly painted as the cause of all the economic problems, becoming scapegoats for issues that were far, far beyond their control.
This rising hostility, it didn't just stay on the streets. It was very quickly channeled into a new political front. You had these emerging nationalist movements that saw a real opportunity to capitalize on all that fear and economic anxiety, and they created a powerful and really divisive new force in European politics.
And what's really important here is to see how this sentiment was weaponized. You had these extreme nationalist parties, like the National Front in France and the Freedom Party in Austria, that just surged in popularity. They ran on explicitly anti-immigrant platforms. And here's the thing, even when they didn't win outright, they successfully dragged the entire political debate over in their direction, forcing mainstream parties to adopt much tougher stances on immigration. So if you want to understand the second half of the 20th century in Europe, it really all comes down to this single core conflict. On one side, you had the undeniable economic necessity that brought millions of people to the continent, and on the other, you had the fierce cultural backlash that erupted the moment that necessity seemed to disappear. But look, this story isn't just history. That tension, the one forged in the 20th century between economic need and cultural identity, it continues to be one of the most defining political and social issues in Europe today. Which really makes you wonder, right? How did the lessons from this era continue to shape the debates that we're still having right now?